Long before satellites mapped the globe and cargo ships crisscrossed the oceans, there was a hidden network of ancient mariners who dared to venture into the unknown. Picture this: waves crashing against wooden hulls, stars guiding the way, and sailors from distant shores exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies that would change the course of history. These weren't just explorers, they were the unsung architects of the first global economy, weaving together civilizations from the Mediterranean to the Pacific with nothing but courage and curiosity. And yet, their stories have been all but erased by time, until now. What if I told you that the roots of today's interconnected world stretch back thousands of years, not to boardrooms or stock markets, but to the decks of ancient ships? From the Phoenicians who traded purple dye across the Mediterranean to the Polynesians who navigated vast stretches of open ocean using only the stars, these seafarers were the original globalists. They didn't just transport spices, silks, or gold, they carried something far more valuable: the seeds of cultural exchange. Think about it: the languages we speak, the foods we eat, even the technologies we rely on today can be traced back to these early maritime networks. But how did they do it? What drove them to risk everything on the open sea? And why have their contributions been overlooked for so long? This isn't just a story about trade routes or shipwrecks, it's a tale of human ingenuity and the unbreakable spirit of exploration. Over the next few minutes, we'll piece together clues from sunken vessels, decipher ancient maps, and follow the trails of artifacts scattered across continents. You'll discover how a single voyage could link the bronze workshops of Mesopotamia to the pearl divers of the Indian Ocean, or how a storm-tossed ship might have accidentally spread revolutionary ideas from one hemisphere to another. By the end, you'll see the ocean not as a divider, but as history's greatest connector, a liquid highway that shaped the world as we know it. So, are you ready to set sail into the past? Let's dive in. Imagine a time when the horizon wasn't a limit but an invitation. The earliest seafarers didn't have maps or compasses, just the wind, the waves, and an unshakable determination to see what lay beyond. Take the Lapita people, for example. These ancient voyagers island hopped across the Pacific more than 3,000 years ago, carrying not just tools and pottery but entire ways of life. Their distinctive stamped ceramics have been found scattered across thousands of miles, a silent testament to connections that spanned vast oceans. But here's the fascinating part: this wasn't random exploration. It was calculated, deliberate trade. Obsidian blades from distant volcanoes, shells from far-off reefs, even food staples like taro and yams, all moved along routes that functioned like prehistoric shipping lanes. Then there's the Mediterranean, where Bronze Age traders turned the sea into a bustling marketplace. Picture cedar logs from Lebanon sailing to Egypt, tin from Anatolia reaching the workshops of Mycenae, and amber from the Baltic turning up in royal tombs along the Nile. These weren't isolated incidents, they were threads in a growing web of interdependence. Ships became the internet of their day, transmitting not just goods but ideas. The design of hulls improved as builders shared techniques across cultures. Navigational knowledge passed from one generation to the next, refined through trial and error under open skies. But what really fueled these voyages? It wasn't just profit, it was something deeper. Curiosity, yes, but also necessity. Coastal resources ran thin, climates shifted, and populations grew. The sea offered solutions, and with each successful journey, confidence grew. A trader who once hugged the shoreline might dare to cross open water after hearing rumors of distant ports. One breakthrough led to another, like dominoes falling across millennia. The result, a world where a farmer in Mesopotamia could eat spices from India, where a chieftain in Scandinavia could wear silk from China, all because someone, somewhere, dared to sail toward the unknown. The real marvel isn't just that these networks existed, it's how they endured. Storms could sink ships, wars could disrupt routes, yet the flow of goods and ideas persisted. That's the untold legacy of these early mariners. They didn't just build trade routes, they built resilience. Every voyage was a gamble, every cargo a leap of faith. And with each return trip, the world grew a little smaller, a little more connected. So the next time you hold a piece of pottery or slip on a bronze bracelet, ask yourself, how many hands, how many waves, how many stories brought it here? The answer might just rewrite how you see history. The Phoenicians didn't just sail the Mediterranean, they rewrote its rules. Picture their ships, sleek and sturdy, cutting through waves from the rocky coasts of Lebanon to the shores of Spain. These weren't mere merchants, they were visionaries who understood that the sea wasn't a barrier but a bridge. Their secret weapon, the bireme, a revolutionary vessel with two banks of oars that could outmaneuver storms and pirates alike. But what truly set them apart was their cargo. Phoenician purple, a dye so rare it took thousands of crushed sea snails to color a single robe, became the ultimate status symbol from Egyptian pharaohs to Greek aristocrats. Yet their most enduring export wasn't fabric or cedar wood, it was knowledge. In bustling ports like Sidon and Byblos, Phoenician traders didn't just unload goods, they exchanged symbols that would change human communication forever. Their alphabet, a simple set of 22 characters, spread like wildfire across trading posts. Greek sailors adapted it, Etruscan merchants refined it, and eventually, those very shapes evolved into the letters you're reading right now. Think about that. Every book, every website, every street sign owes a debt to those ancient mariners who carved letters onto clay tablets between voyages. What's astonishing is how they turned commerce into cultural osmosis. A single Phoenician ship could carry Egyptian papyrus, Cypriot copper, and Iberian silver, all while crew members swapped stories that wove together myths from a dozen civilizations. Their trade routes became information superhighways, transmitting not just spices but philosophies, not just glass beads but groundbreaking technologies. When Carthage, their greatest colony, later rivaled Rome, it wasn't just wealth that made it powerful, it was centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of sailors who knew the sea's secrets. But here's the twist, the Phoenicians left almost no written records of their own. Like ghostly navigators, their legacy exists in the traces they left on others, Greek historians praising their shipbuilding, Hebrew scriptures mentioning their fabrics, Roman laws borrowing their maritime codes. Even their famous purple dye, once worth its weight in gold, faded from history until chemists recently decoded its molecular structure. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of these seafaring pioneers. True influence isn't about monuments or manifestos, but about planting seeds in foreign soil and watching them grow into forests. So the next time you write a note or admire a deep blue fabric, remember, you're touching fragments of a forgotten empire that once stitched the ancient world together, one voyage at a time. The Mediterranean world thrived for centuries, its kingdoms linked by bronze and trade until the day the ships came. Around 1200 BC, coastal cities from Greece to Egypt burned under a storm of arrows and swords. The attackers left no monuments, no grand inscriptions boasting of their victories. History remembers them only as the Sea Peoples, a shadowy alliance of raiders who appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. But who were they really? Pirates preying on weakened empires, refugees fleeing famine and drought, or perhaps warriors displaced by some forgotten catastrophe. One clue lies in the ruins they left behind. Archaeologists sifting through layers of ash in places like Ugarit and Troy found something startling, not just evidence of destruction, but also of reinvention. The old trade routes collapsed, yes, but in their place arose new networks. Bronze gave way to iron, centralized kingdoms splintered into smaller, more agile states. The Sea Peoples didn't just bring chaos, they inadvertently forced survivors to innovate. Imagine a merchant in Cyprus, once reliant on Egyptian grain, suddenly turning to local crops or experimenting with iron tools because the old supply chains had vanished. Crisis became catalyst. Recent discoveries suggest climate may have been the unseen hand behind this upheaval. Tree rings and sediment cores tell a story of prolonged droughts and failed harvests stretching from the Aegean to the Levant. If the Sea Peoples were desperate migrants rather than mere marauders, it changes everything. Their raids weren't mindless violence, they were acts of survival, the last resort of entire communities pushed to the brink. A single bad harvest could send a village to sea. A decade of scarcity could unleash an armada. Yet from the ashes of this collapse emerged something unexpected: resilience. The Phoenicians, who would later dominate Mediterranean trade, may have gotten their start in this chaotic era, adapting faster than their rivals. Coastal cities rebuilt with stronger walls, sailors developed better navigation techniques, and new trade routes snaked around the wreckage of the old. The lesson here isn't just about vulnerability, it's about adaptation. When the world you know collapses, you don't just survive, you reinvent. So what does this mean for us today? Modern supply chains, with their container ships and just-in-time deliveries, might seem invincible, but the Sea Peoples remind us that no system is immune to disruption, whether from war, climate, or sheer unpredictability. The difference is we have the advantage of hindsight. Those ancient sailors didn't see the storm coming. We do. The question isn't if the next crisis will arrive, but how we'll navigate it when it does. Will we cling to the old ways, or will we, like the survivors of the Bronze Age, find new paths across the waves? While the Mediterranean's trade empires rose and fell, another maritime network was quietly rewriting the rules of global exchange, one that stretched from the sun-baked shores of Zanzibar to the spice-laden ports of Sumatra. The Indian Ocean wasn't just a body of water. It was a vast, liquid crossroads where monsoons acted as nature's metronome, dictating the rhythm of commerce. Twice a year, winds reversed with clockwork precision, blowing northeast in summer and southwest in winter. Sailors didn't fight these patterns, they harnessed them, planning voyages around these natural cycles like train conductors consulting a timetable. At the heart of this system was the how, a ship so perfectly adapted to its environment it might as well have grown from the ocean itself. With its triangular lateen sails catching every whisper of wind and a shallow draft allowing navigation upriver, the how became the pickup truck of the ancient world, equally at home carrying African ivory to India or ferrying Indonesian nutmeg to Arabia. But what truly set this network apart wasn't just the ships or the goods. It was the unspoken code of cooperation that spanned cultures. Unlike the Mediterranean, where Phoenicians and Greeks vied for dominance, the Indian Ocean thrived on interdependence. A Swahili merchant might partner with a Gujarati trader, who in turn worked with a Malay navigator, each link in the chain respecting local customs and maritime laws. Consider the port of Calicut on India's Malabar coast, where a Chinese admiral named Zheng he once marveled at the harmony of commerce. Arab traders haggled over pepper next to Jewish spice brokers, while Tamil shipwrights repaired vessels from as far away as Zanzibar. No single empire controlled these waters instead. They functioned like an ancient version of free trade zones where taxes were low, piracy was rare, and shared knowledge flowed as freely as the goods. When monsoons forced sailors to wait months for return voyages, these strangers became neighbors, exchanging not just cargo but recipes, music, and even marriage proposals. The real currency here wasn't gold or silver, it was trust. A merchant in Mogadishu could extend credit to a counterpart in Canton based solely on reputation, with agreements sealed by nothing more than a handshake and a shared meal. This system birthed innovations we still use today: bills of exchange to avoid carrying coinage, maritime insurance pools to spread risk, even standardized weights and measures accepted from Madagascar to Malacca. Perhaps most remarkably, this network became a conveyor belt for ideas as much as commodities. Buddhism caught rides on merchant ships to Java, Islam traveled peacefully to the Swahili coast, and Hindu temple designs migrated to Cambodia, all without conquest or coercion. The ruins of Angkor Wat bear Tamil inscriptions, while East African mosques display Indian architectural flourishes. Even language transformed, with Swahili absorbing so many Arabic and Persian loanwords, it became the lingua franca of coastal trade. So why does this matter now? In an age of trade wars and tariffs, the Indian Ocean model offers a forgotten blueprint. Here was a system where profit didn't require domination, where cultural exchange happened organically rather than by force. When modern diplomats struggle with globalization's tensions, they might look to these ancient mariners who turned diversity into strength. After all, the monsoons didn't care whose flag flew overhead, they simply blew, as they always had, inviting cooperation across the waves. The vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean would have terrified most ancient sailors. Endless blue in every direction, no landmarks, no guarantees. But for Polynesian navigators, this was home. Their double-hulled canoes, some longer than 80 feet, weren't just boats. They were floating ecosystems carrying everything needed to start anew: breadfruit saplings, taro shoots, even pigs and chickens. Imagine setting sail knowing you might not find land for weeks, trusting only the stars above and the patterns of waves beneath. These weren't desperate castaways. They were master strategists executing a deliberate, generations-long project to settle the planet's most remote corners. What's astonishing isn't just their success, it's the precision. The Polynesian Triangle, a region larger than North and South America combined, was mapped not with compasses or charts, but with an oral encyclopedia of celestial knowledge. Navigators memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, each one a celestial signpost. They read ocean swells like fingerprints, detecting distant islands by how waves refracted around them. Birds became living compasses. The flight path of a tern at dusk might reveal land over the horizon. This wasn't guesswork, it was science honed over centuries. Take the sweet potato, a crop native to South America. How did it wind up in Polynesian gardens centuries before Europeans reached the Pacific? The answer lies in a voyage, or perhaps many voyages, that connected Polynesians with indigenous South Americans. Picture two groups meeting on some distant shore, exchanging not just goods but agricultural wisdom. This wasn't just trade, it was the birth of a transoceanic network, proof that even the world's greatest water barrier couldn't stifle human connection. But why leave paradise? Overpopulation, rivalry, or simply the allure of the unknown? Each island tells a different story. In Tahitian oral histories, chiefs sent out explorers to claim new lands, expanding their influence across the waves. In Maori tradition, the great navigator Coop chased a giant octopus to discover Aotearoa, now New Zealand. These weren't random journeys, they were calculated risks, with entire communities sometimes packing into canoes to follow promising reports. The real marvel is how they transformed every landing into a homeland. On arrival, they didn't just survive, they thrived. In Hawaii, they built fish ponds so sophisticated they're still studied by engineers today. On Easter Island, they erected towering moai statues, each one a declaration of identity in isolation. And everywhere they went, they carried their most precious cargo, knowledge. Stories, chants, and navigation techniques passed down through generations, ensuring that even if a canoe never returned, its lessons would. So when we marvel at modern explorers, astronauts, deep-sea divers, we're really standing on the shoulders of these ancient voyagers. They didn't have satellites or sonar, just an unshakable faith in their ability to read the world around them. And in that, they left us a question. In our age of GPS and instant maps, have we lost something vital? The art of truly knowing the Earth, not through screens, but through the wind, the waves, and the stars themselves. The ocean currents of the Indian and Pacific carried more than saltwater. They bore the weight of empires. While camel caravans crept across deserts, Chinese junks with battened sails raced the monsoons, their hulls stuffed with treasures that would redefine global commerce. Picture a Tang Dynasty merchant in Guangzhou loading crates of celadon porcelain so fine it rang like a bell when struck, knowing these delicate pieces would grace palaces from Baghdad to Venice. Meanwhile, Arabdi, how captains counted amphorae of frankincense bound for Buddhist temples in China, where the sacred smoke would mingle with sandalwood from Timor. The Belitung shipwreck off Indonesia tells this story in shattered pottery and salvaged gold. Discovered in the late 20th century, this 9th century Arabian how carried 60,000 pieces of Tang ceramics, proof of a supply chain so vast it makes modern logistics pale. But here's what's extraordinary. The cargo wasn't just Chinese. Persian jars nestled beside Thai bronzes, while an intricately crafted silver ewer bore motifs blending Islamic geometry with Chinese phoenixes. This wasn't just trade, it was alchemy where cultures fused in the holds of ships. Power shifted with the tides. When the Tang dynasty collapsed, maritime silk road hubs like Palembang in Sumatra rose to fill the vacuum. The Srivijaya Empire became the Amazon of its day, controlling choke points like the Malacca Strait and taxing every passing ship. Their secret, not military might, but diplomacy. By protecting merchants from pirates and offering fair tariffs, they turned a jungle river port into the world's busiest trading hub. Glass tells another tale. Roman glassmakers had perfected techniques lost to Europe's dark ages, but their secrets survived in Baghdad furnaces. Arab traders carried this knowledge eastward, where Chinese artisans adapted it to create stunning cobalt blue glaze for porcelain. The result, a technological feedback loop, Middle Eastern chemistry meeting Chinese craftsmanship to birth an export so coveted it became synonymous with luxury, China. Yet the sea route's greatest impact was invisible, the spread of ideas. A Persian navigational manual might inspire a Javanese star chart, while a Buddhist sutra translated in Guangzhou could wind up in a Javanese monastery. Paper itself, a Chinese invention, reached Europe via these maritime highways, revolutionizing record-keeping from Venetian banks to Andalusian libraries. So why does this matter? Because these routes rewrote the rules of influence. Land empires rose and fell, but the sea connected everyone. A sultan in Malacca could shape events in Cairo. A Chinese admiral's voyage might alter prices in Alexandria. Unlike the overland Silk Road, where caravans relied on stable empires, the maritime network thrived on flexibility. Ships could reroute around wars or disasters, making commerce resilient even when politics fractured. The lesson for us is clear. Then as now, the future belongs not to those who control territory, but to those who master connections. When the next wave of globalization rises, it won't follow borders on a map, it'll ride the currents, just as it did 1,200 years ago. And somewhere beneath the waves, another Belitung wreck likely waits, ready to remind us how small our world has always been. The image of a Viking longship cutting through icy northern waters evokes fearsome warriors with horned helmets, but history paints a far more nuanced picture. Those same sleek vessels that raided monasteries also carried bolts of fine English wool to markets in Norway, and Baltic amber destined for the workshops of Constantinople. A single longship might raid a coastal village one season only to return the next as a trading envoy, its crew swapping swords for scales. This duality wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. In a world where wealth flowed along unpredictable currents, the Vikings mastered the art of switching roles to seize opportunity. Consider the evidence buried in Scandinavian soil. Hordes of Islamic silver dirhams stamped with the names of caliphs from Baghdad and Samarkand. These coins didn't wash ashore by accident. They were payment for goods transported thousands of miles by Viking middlemen. Furs from the Arctic, walrus ivory from Greenland, and yes, enslaved people captured in the British Isles all moved along these routes. The Vikings didn't just participate in the medieval economy, they hacked it, using their unrivaled ship technology to connect markets others couldn't reach. A merchant in Kiev might trade Saxon iron for Persian silk without ever leaving the docks, thanks to Viking networks stretching from the Volga to the Caspian Sea. Their settlements tell the same story. Take Dublin, founded as a raiding base but transformed into Europe's largest slave market by the 10th century. Or Novgorod, where Scandinavian traders negotiated with Byzantine officials under the watchful eyes of Slavic guards. These weren't lawless outposts but cosmopolitan hubs where languages and currencies mixed as freely as goods. A Viking trader might speak Old Norse with his crew, bargain in Arabic with a visiting merchant, and pay taxes in Saxon silver, all before noon. But here's what's fascinating. The line between trader and raider was often blurry by design. A fleet might arrive peacefully, only to turn violent if negotiations soured. Coastal communities quickly learned that welcoming Viking ships with open markets was safer than resisting them. This wasn't pure thuggery, it was a calculated system of incentives. Why burn a village when you could tax it annually? Over time, some Viking leaders realized that stable trade yielded richer rewards than constant plunder. The transformation was so complete that by the 11th century, former raiders like Olaf Tryggvason were posing as Christian kings to secure European trading rights. The lesson here isn't just about Vikings, it's about how commerce and conquest have always been two sides of the same coin. From the East India Company to modern corporate colonialism, the pattern repeats. First comes the sword, then the ledger. What set the Vikings apart was their honesty about it. They didn't pretend to be mere merchants when their wealth was built on the backs of captives, nor did they disguise their business acumen behind warrior myths. In their world, power flowed not just from what you could take, but from how far you could sell it. So the next time you see a Viking helmet in a museum, look past the battle dents. Notice the tiny scales often found alongside swords in graves, a silent testament to a culture that understood the true price of everything. Their legacy isn't just about pillaging, it's a reminder that the routes of commerce have always been paved with both gold and blood. The Swahili coast shimmered like a string of pearls along East Africa's edge, each city-state a glittering node in a network that spanned continents. Take Kilwa, perched on an island off modern Tanzania. At its height, this was no backwater trading post, it was a metropolis with multi-story stone houses, a grand sultan's palace with an octagonal swimming pool, and a mosque whose domes caught the first light of dawn. The coins minted here, inscribed in elegant Arabic script, have been found as far away as Australia's Wessel Islands, carried by monsoon winds and the tides of commerce. What made these cities extraordinary wasn't just their wealth, but their alchemy of cultures. Walk through the ruins of Jeddah, a Swahili town hidden in Kenya's coastal forests, and you'll find Chinese porcelain fragments beside Persian glassware, all layered with local pottery. The Swahili language itself is a living archive of this fusion Bantu grammar woven with Arabic loanwords, Persian nautical terms, and even traces of Portuguese from later encounters. A single word like chai tea tells a story that begins in Mandarin, passes through Persian and Arabic, and finally settles into Swahili, just as the beverage itself traveled those same routes. These weren't passive way stations. Swahili merchants ventured deep into the African interior, following elephant trails that became caravan routes. At Great Zimbabwe, over 200 miles inland, archaeologists uncovered 12th century Chinese celadon and Middle Eastern glass proof that gold from the kingdom's mines reached the coast despite the distance. In return, coastal traders brought back Indian cottons and Maldivian cowrie shells, which became currency in inland empires. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Luxury goods cemented political alliances, which secured more trade, which brought more luxuries. The architecture still whispers of this sophistication. Coral reefs weren't just harvested for building blocks, they were baked into lime mortar that hardened like concrete, allowing structures to soar. In Lamu's narrow alleys, houses feature intricately carved wooden doors with motifs borrowed from Amani palaces, but adapted with local flora and fauna. Even the layout of towns reflected cultural layers. Arab-style courtyard homes built with African techniques, oriented toward Mecca but cooled by Indian Ocean breezes. Yet for all their achievements, the Swahili city-states were nearly erased from popular history. European colonizers later dismissed the ruins as the work of outsiders, unable to conceive that Africans had engineered such marvels. The truth is far more compelling. When Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama arrived in the late 15th century, his scribes marveled at cities, equal to our Lisbon in size and dignity, ruled by black sultans who wore silk and quoted Persian poetry. That disconnect between reality and later prejudice explains why these African maritime pioneers remain overshadowed by tales of European discovery. Perhaps the greatest testament to Swahili resilience lies in their intangible legacy. The evening call to prayer along today's coast still carries the same melodic inflections heard 7 centuries ago, blending Arabic tones with African rhythms. The recipes for biryani and samosas, now considered quintessentially Swahili, preserve the flavors of 1,000 ships' kitchens. Even the practice of threading jasmine flowers into bridal braids connects modern weddings to the perfumed courts of medieval Zanzibar. These aren't just cultural artifacts, they're living proof that the ocean's greatest gifts weren't cargoes of gold or spices, but the irreversible mingling of worlds. The oversight of Swahili achievements speaks to deeper biases in how we chronicle the past. We remember conquerors who took land, but often forget the connectors who built bridges between civilizations. Yet in an era when global trade faces new tensions, these coastal cities offer a quiet lesson. Prosperity flourishes not behind walls, but on open shores where the tide brings new ideas with each dawn. The Ming Dynasty's treasure ships were floating cities, their decks wide enough to hold entire markets. When Admiral Zheng He's fleet appeared on the horizon off the coast of East Africa in the early 15th century, witnesses described vessels with 9 masts and crimson silk sails, their hulls painted with fearsome dragon eyes to ward off evil spirits. These weren't just ships, they were moving embassies, carrying not just Chinese porcelain and silk but astronomers, doctors, and diplomats bearing gifts from the Yongle Emperor. A single voyage might transport giraffes from Melindi to awe the imperial court, while African envoys sailed back to Nanjing to prostrate themselves before the Son of Heaven. What's often overlooked is the sheer sophistication of these missions. Unlike later European explorers who came with Bibles and cannons, Zheng He's fleets operated on a principle of mutual benefit. In Calicut, they exchanged navigational charts with Arab scholars. In Sumatra, they mediated local disputes. In Hormuz, they marveled at Persian water clocks, bringing the designs home to improve Chinese timekeeping. The treasure voyages weren't about extraction, they were the ancient world's most ambitious cultural exchange program, a floating Silk Road that prioritized dialogue over domination. The fleet scale still staggers historians. The largest Beochuan ships stretched 400 feet, longer than a football field, with displacement estimates rivaling 18th-century warships. They carried hydroponic gardens to prevent scurvy, compartmentalized hulls to survive storms, and magnetic compasses refined by generations of Arab and Chinese navigators. While Portuguese caravels later crept down the African coast hugging shorelines, Zheng He's fleet crossed the Indian Ocean directly, using star maps so precise they guided sailors within half a degree of latitude. Yet the most intriguing question isn't how they sailed, but why they stopped. In 1433, a new emperor banned ocean-going voyages, burned the fleet's records, and turned China inward. The reasons were complex: factional court politics, the cost of defending the northern frontier against Mongols, a philosophical shift favoring agrarian life over commerce. But the consequences were undeniable. Just as Portugal's Henry the Navigator was funding expeditions down Africa's coast, China scuttled its maritime supremacy. The torch of global exploration passed westward, not because Europeans were superior navigators, but because they were hungrier. Imagine an alternate timeline where the treasure fleets kept sailing. Would Chinese merchants have rounded the Cape of Good Hope before Vasco da Gama? Might Mandarin, not Spanish, have become the lingua franca of trade? The clues lie in fragments: a Ming-style vase unearthed in the Caribbean, a Venetian map depicting islands that resemble the Americas decades before Columbus. These tantalizing hints suggest the fleet's reach may have extended even further than records show. The real tragedy isn't just the fleet's dissolution, it's the loss of its philosophy. Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch risen from captivity to command, embodied the Ming ideal of meritocracy over bloodline. His voyages celebrated diversity, with crews including Hui astronomers, Malay interpreters, and Tamil pilots. Had this model prevailed, globalization might have worn a different face, less about conquest, more about connection. As modern ships retrace these ancient routes carrying containerized goods, they unknowingly sail in the wake of a vision that vanished too soon, one where the ocean wasn't a highway for empires, but a bridge between civilizations. In the dense jungles of 5 tiny islands in eastern Indonesia, trees grew that would rewrite the course of history. The Moluccas, better known as the Spice Islands, were the only place on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew wild, a botanical fluke that turned this remote archipelago into the center of the ancient world's most lucrative trade. Arab traders called these islands Jazirat al-Mulk, the Islands of Kings, not for their size but for the fortunes hidden in their bark and buds. A single sack of cloves could buy a man a herd of camels in medieval Cairo, while a handful of nutmeg was worth half a year's wages in London. The spice routes were the internet of their day, transmitting wealth and knowledge across continents. Malay sailors, reading the monsoon winds like ancient algorithms, carried nutmeg to Sri Lanka, where Arab middlemen traded it west to Venice. From there, Italian merchants marked up prices tenfold before selling to European elites desperate to flavor their bland diets and display their status. The logistics were staggering. A clove picked in Ternate might pass through 20 hands before garnishing a noble's plate in Lisbon, each transaction adding layers of profit and legend. Europeans spun wild tales about spices to justify their exorbitant costs. Medieval texts claimed nutmeg grew only on trees guarded by winged serpents, while pepper supposedly grew in valleys patrolled by fire-breathing dragons. The truth was far more fascinating. Spice cultivation was a closely guarded science passed down through generations in the Moluccas. Clove farmers used a complex system of grafting to ensure genetic purity, while nutmeg growers timed harvests to the phases of the moon to maximize oil content. These weren't just crops, they were intellectual property protected by indigenous knowledge that outsiders couldn't replicate. When Portuguese caravels finally breached the Indian Ocean in the 16th century, they didn't discover the spice trade, they crashed it. Vasco da Gama's brutal capture of Arab Dhows off Malabar shocked the delicate ecosystem of trust that had sustained commerce for centuries. Where Malay and Arab traders had operated on credit and kinship, Europeans demanded monopoly at sword point. The shift was catastrophic. Portuguese forts sprouted like tumors along trade routes, while Dutch colonizers later resorted to burning entire nutmeg groves on other islands to artificially inflate prices. The VOC, history's first multinational corporation, valued a single Moluccan island at 60 tons of gold, not for its land, but for the trees growing on it. Yet the spice trade's darkest legacy wasn't economic, it was human. To control production, Europeans uprooted entire communities, shipping skilled growers to plantations in Grenada and Zanzibar while suppressing local knowledge. The Banda Islands saw near genocide when Dutch forces reduced 15,000 islanders to 600 in a single decade, all to secure a nutmeg monopoly. The spices that once symbolized connection became tools of subjugation, their scent masking the blood spilled for control. What gets lost in this grim history is the pre-European system's sophistication. Before colonialism, the Moluccas operated like a medieval OPEC, with sultans coordinating harvests to stabilize prices. Malay sailors used celestial navigation to maintain just-in-time deliveries across thousands of miles, while Javanese ports developed advanced warehousing to handle seasonal surpluses. This wasn't primitive barter, it was a complex, globalized market where supply chains stretched farther than Roman roads ever did. The irony, Europe's spice obsession backfired. As colonial plantations flooded markets, prices collapsed. Nutmeg that once bought land became cheap enough to sprinkle on Christmas eggnog. The real winners were the original growers' descendants, who secretly preserved cuttings of prized varieties. Today, walking through a Moluccan village, you might still find a grandmother's backyard clove tree descended from saplings smuggled past Dutch inspectors, a living rebellion against the idea that flavor could ever truly be owned. The night sky was more than a canvas of stars for ancient mariners. It was a celestial roadmap etched in constellations. Polynesian navigators didn't just glance upward. They internalized the heavens, memorizing the rising and setting points of over 250 stars. Each one functioned like a cosmic street sign, with names passed down through chants that encoded generations of observational science. But their mastery didn't stop there. They read the ocean itself, detecting distant islands by subtle changes in swells, a skill modern scientists later confirmed by studying wave refraction patterns. A trained navigator could sense land over the horizon by how the sea breathed. Long before any glimpse of palm trees, half a world away, Arab traders harnessed the astrolabe, a device so precise it transformed navigation from art to applied mathematics. Originally developed by Greek astronomers, Islamic scholars like al-Biruni refined it into a portable computer that could calculate latitude by measuring the angle of the North Star. Picture a ship's captain off the coast of Oman, holding this brass instrument to the sky, its rotating discs revealing his position within miles, all without a single line of written calculation. The astrolabe's genius lay in its adaptability. Its plates could be swapped for different latitudes, making it the first global positioning system. Then there were the Vikings, braving the North Atlantic's fog with sunstone's crystals of calcite or cordierite that polarized sunlight to locate the sun's position even on overcast days. Modern experiments prove these stones could pinpoint the sun's azimuth within 5 degrees, effectively turning cloudy skies into navigational aids. Combine this with their sun compass, a wooden disc that tracked shadows, and you have a navigation suite rugged enough for open ocean voyages yet simple enough to fit in a single chest. But perhaps the most ingenious tool came from the Marshall Islands' stick charts. These intricate lattices of palm ribs and shells weren't maps in the traditional sense. Instead, they encoded wave patterns, currents, and the positions of atolls through abstract curves and intersections. A pilot would memorize the chart before departure, then read the ocean's movements by feeling the vessel's motion beneath him. It was kinetic navigation, a tactile dialogue between sailor and sea. What unites these technologies isn't just ingenuity, but their deep attunement to natural phenomena. Today's GPS satellites may seem worlds apart from a Viking sunstone, but both solve the same fundamental problem. How do we know where we are? The difference lies in engagement. Ancient navigators didn't just consume data, they participated in an unbroken conversation with their environment, deciphering starlight, interpreting wave songs, feeling magnetic fields through lodestones. There's a lesson here for our algorithm-driven age. Reliance on digital navigation has eroded our environmental literacy. Many couldn't find north without a smartphone. Yet pockets of revival exist. The Polynesian Voyaging Society's Hokular canoe recently circled the globe using only traditional wayfinding, proving these skills aren't relics but living knowledge. Meanwhile, NASA studies Marshallese stick charts to design more intuitive space navigation systems. The past isn't just prologue, it's a toolbox for reimagining how we move through our world. So the next time you plug coordinates into your phone, consider this. The greatest navigation technology ever invented isn't silicon-based, it's the human brain's capacity to weave observation, memory, and imagination into understanding. The stars that guided ancient sailors still shine, the waves still carry their old rhythms. We've just forgotten how to listen. Ancient shipbuilders were the original problem solvers, crafting vessels as unique as the waters they sailed. Along the Nile, Egyptians lashed together bundles of papyrus reeds to create lightweight boats that could glide through shallow marshes, perfect for transporting blocks of limestone to pyramid sites. But when Phoenician merchants needed to haul cedar logs from Lebanon to Egypt, they developed the first true keel ships with deep hulls that could withstand Mediterranean storms. Each innovation emerged from necessity, a dialogue between human ambition and the relentless sea. The lateen sail revolutionized maritime travel like no other invention. Borrowed from Arab dhow builders, this triangular sail could catch wind from any angle, allowing ships to zigzag against prevailing winds, a technique called tacking. Suddenly, traders weren't slaves to seasonal monsoons. They could sail almost year-round. The impact was staggering. Mediterranean grain shipments to Rome tripled, feeding the empire's million citizens. Chinese merchants adopted the design for their junks, combining it with another breakthrough, bulkheads. These watertight compartments acted like sealed chambers, so if one flooded, the ship wouldn't sink. Marco Polo marveled at this system centuries later, noting how it saved countless vessels from disaster. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Austronesian sailors faced a different challenge. Their double-hulled canoes needed stability for open ocean voyages, so they added outriggers floating arms that functioned like training wheels for ships. This simple addition allowed them to carry heavier loads across thousands of miles of open water. Archaeologists found proof in the cargo: basalt tools from Samoa turning up in Fiji, volcanic glass from New Britain reaching as far as Borneo. The outrigger wasn't just a flotation device, it was the key to the world's first long-distance maritime network. Roman engineers took a brute force approach. Their grain ships, some over 180 feet long, relied on sheer size to dominate Mediterranean trade. Pliny the Elder described vessels so massive they required entire forests for timber, with crews tossing anchors weighing over 7 tons. Yet for all their might, these ships had a critical weakness. Without the lateen sail, they depended on rowers and favorable winds. When the empire fell, the technology vanished for centuries, proof that innovation without adaptation is fragile. What connected these disparate cultures was a shared understanding that ships weren't just transport, they were floating ecosystems. Viking longships carried smithies to repair weapons mid-journey. Polynesian canoes transported potted breadfruit trees to colonize new islands. Chinese junks included onboard fish tanks to keep meals fresh. Every design choice reflected deeper priorities: speed for raiders, capacity for merchants, endurance for explorers. The legacy of these breakthroughs surrounds us today. Modern container ships still use reinforced keels derived from Phoenician designs. Cruise ships employ compartmentalized hulls inspired by Chinese junks. Even the America's Cup racing yachts harness lateen sail principles with their high-tech wing sails. The ocean hasn't changed, but our ability to navigate it has, standing on the shoulders of those ancient visionaries who first dared to rethink what a ship could be. Piracy wasn't just a shadowy underworld, it was an open secret woven into the fabric of ancient commerce. Take the case of Rhodes, a Mediterranean powerhouse built on trade. Their solution to pirate threats wasn't just defensive galleys patrolling the coast. It was issuing licenses to privateers, essentially legalizing piracy against rival state ships. These weren't renegades, but state-sanctioned operators who split their plunder with the government. The message was clear: protection came at a price, and that price often looked a lot like extortion. Half a world away, the Hanseatic League took this idea further. This network of Baltic and North Sea merchants didn't just hire muscle, they built their own navy. When pirates threatened their grain shipments, the League's warships didn't just defend, they blockaded entire kingdoms until rulers cracked down on raiders. In 1400, they even besieged Copenhagen to force the Danish king to police his waters. Trade wasn't just business, it was geopolitical leverage where merchant guilds could outgun kings. Yet nowhere was the pirate protector dynamic more fluid than in the Caribbean. English privateers like Francis Drake carried royal letters allowing them to raid Spanish treasure fleet, so long as the crown got its cut. Port Royal in Jamaica became a paradox, a pirate haven where stolen goods fueled the local economy, all while British governors turned a blind eye, the unspoken rule. Attack our enemies, not our allies, and everyone profits. Even famous pirates like Henry Morgan received knighthoods, their crimes laundered into patriotism. What's revealing is how these systems mirrored the trade they disrupted. Just as spices or silks moved along established routes, piracy followed predictable patterns. Barbary corsairs in the Mediterranean knew Christian merchant ships would avoid certain coasts in winter, perfect for ambushes. South China Sea pirates timed raids to the monsoon schedules of fat-bellied junks laden with porcelain. This wasn't chaos, it was commerce by other means, with its own ledgers and supply chains. The real takeaway: maritime power has always been fluid. A pirate today could be a privateer tomorrow, or even a governor next year. The distinction between criminal and hero depended less on actions than on who kept the books. When empires lacked the resources to police vast oceans, they outsourced the job, often to the very raiders they'd condemned. The sea, after all, doesn't recognize flags or laws, only force and opportunity. Modern parallels abound, from mercenaries guarding oil tankers to cyber privateers hacking for governments. The blurred lines persist. The ancient world understood what we sometimes forget. Security and predation aren't opposites, they're two sides of the same coin, flipping in the tide of who holds power. The next time you see a naval patrol or a corporate security fleet, ask yourself, who's paying them and who's paying the price? Ports hummed with the sound of a dozen languages colliding, Aramaic merchants haggling with Tamil sailors, Greek philosophers debating Persian astrologers under swaying palm roofs. This was where worlds blurred. Take the goddess Aphrodite, worshipped by Greek traders in Egypt. By the time her cult reached India via Phoenician ships, she'd transformed into a lotus-holding deity named Hariti, guardian of sailors and children. The same divine essence, reshaped by each culture that embraced her. Music traveled just as fluidly. Oud players from Baghdad picked up rhythms from East African drummers in Zanzibar's markets, creating new melodies that would later evolve into flamenco in Spain. A single instrument's journey from Mesopotamian lyres to Moorish lutes to European guitars traces the invisible highways of maritime exchange. Even food tells this story. The humble coconut, native to Southeast Asia, became a staple in East African cuisine after Arab traders carried it across the Indian Ocean. Today, Swahili cooks still use coconut milk in dishes bearing Persian names, served on Chinese porcelain. Buddhism's spread reveals how ideas transformed at sea. When monk scholars boarded merchant ships bound for Java and China, they didn't just carry scriptures, they adapted them. The serene Avalokiteshvara, a male bodhisattva in Indian texts, gradually became the feminine Guanyin in China, her mercy resonating with local goddess traditions. Shipwreck discoveries off Indonesia show bronze Buddhas with distinctly Hellenistic curls, evidence of Greek artistic influences absorbed along the trade routes. These fusions weren't accidents. Ship captains deliberately recruited multilingual crews to bridge cultures. A Persian navigator might speak enough Tamil to negotiate with Chola kingdom officials, while a Malay sailor could translate between Arabic and Mandarin. Port cities developed hybrid legal systems, part Islamic maritime law, part Hindu contract customs, part Roman trade regulations, all designed to keep commerce flowing smoothly between strangers. The real surprise, how deeply these exchanges penetrated daily life. In medieval Calicut, Hindu temple dancers performed stories from the Persian epic Shahnameh. Sicilian silk weavers incorporated Arabic calligraphy into designs for Christian altar pieces. Even children's games spread along trade routes. Chess pieces carved in Kerala followed the same rules as those played in Samarkand tea houses. What made the sea such an effective cultural blender? Necessity. On land, empires could enforce conformity through armies and edicts, but the ocean belonged to no one. A ship's crew might include Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists sharing the same deck, forced to find common ground. Ports became neutral zones where differences softened in pursuit of mutual survival. The goods being traded, spices, textiles, gems, were almost incidental compared to the intangible cargo of ideas that traveled with them. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in what didn't survive. Fragments of a Sanskrit Javanese dictionary found in Bali suggest thriving multilingualism now lost to time. Ship logs detail performances of plays blending Greek tragedy with Indian Kathakali dance. Art forms vanished except in scattered manuscripts. Yet their spirit endures. The next time you hear a Portuguese fado song with its mournful scales, you're hearing the echoes of Arab sailors' chants. When you see a Japanese torii gate's curved architecture, you're glimpsing influences from Pacific canoe prows. The scene never forgets, it simply reinvents. Beneath the polished artifacts and triumphant trade ledgers of antiquity lies a darker currency: human lives. Long before the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, Phoenician merchants were shackling captives in the hulls of their ships alongside amphorae of olive oil. Greek city-states built their economies on silver mines worked by Thracian slaves, while Viking raiders turned entire Irish coastal villages into commodities, selling them in bustling Constantinople slave markets. The scale staggers. Archaeologists estimate that at its peak, 1 in 3 residents of Rome was enslaved. This wasn't just incidental violence, it was systematized commerce. In the Indian Ocean, monsoon winds carried more than spices. They propelled dhows loaded with African captives to Persian Gulf ports, where Zanj laborers from Kenya drained marshes for Abbasid caliphs. Venetian notaries kept meticulous records of Slavic slaves sold to Egyptian sultans, their contracts specifying no defects, like a merchant inspecting pottery. The paperwork of bondage, bills of sale, tax receipts, even manumission certificates reveals how deeply slavery was woven into the machinery of early globalization. Yet enslaved people weren't just cargo. They were often the gears that made trade function. On Roman grain ships, enslaved rowers provided the muscle that fed the empire, their chained wrists pulling oars to the beat of a hortator's drum. In the Malay archipelago, multilingual slaves served as translators between Chinese merchants and Javanese rulers. Some even shaped exploration. The Moroccan slave Estevanico survived a shipwreck in the 1520s to become the first African to traverse North America, guiding Spanish expeditions through lands he'd learned from indigenous communities. The economic impact was seismic. Athenian silver mines, worked by 30,000 enslaved laborers, financed the Parthenon. Carthage's wealth came partly from enslaved Sicilians processing murex shells for purple dye. Viking Dublin thrived as Europe's largest slave market for 2 centuries, its economy built on trafficking Celts to Islamic Spain. These weren't peripheral operations, they were central to state revenues, with tariffs on slave sales funding palaces, navies, and even public games. What chills the blood isn't just the brutality, but the bureaucracy. Assyrian tablets from 900 BC detail rations for enslaved quarry workers, barley measured to the ounce. Roman law classified slaves as speaking tools, while Han Dynasty records list enslaved Koreans traded for iron plows. The cold efficiency of these systems reveals how early elites divorced human suffering from economic gain, a cognitive dissonance that echoes in modern supply chains. Yet resistance flickered persistently. The Zanj rebellion in 9th century Iraq saw thousands of East African slaves overthrow plantations, holding Basra for 14 years. In Roman Sicily, Yunus the Syrian led a revolt so formidable it required multiple legions to crush. Even on ships, mutinies were common. Viking sagas tell of enslaved warriors turning on their captors mid-voyage. These weren't isolated incidents but proof that the trade's victims never passively accepted their fate. The uncomfortable truth: the first global economy didn't just tolerate slavery, it depended on it. From the copper mines of Cyprus to the pearl beds of Bahrain, forced labor greased the wheels of commerce across continents. When we admire ancient glassware or wear replica Viking jewelry, we're touching objects likely produced by unseen hands in chains. This isn't about assigning modern guilt, but about recognizing how progress and oppression have always been tangled, and asking what invisible sacrifices underpin today's interconnected world. Cowrie shells from the Maldives clinked in the pouches of West African merchants long before gold coins ever reached their shores. These tiny, glossy shells, dug from the ocean floor, drilled with holes, and strung into belts, became the world's first global currency, accepted from China to the Congo. But why cowries? They were durable, impossible to counterfeit, and rare enough to hold value yet plentiful enough to circulate. A single sack could buy a canoe in the Niger Delta or pay a month's wages for a laborer in Bengal. The ocean, which connected trade routes, also provided the very currency that made them possible. Half a world away, Mesopotamian merchants faced a different challenge: how to track debts across vast distances. Their solution: clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform receipts, some even encased in clay envelopes for security. Imagine a trader in Ur shipping barley to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and receiving a tablet as proof of payment, redeemable at any affiliated port. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was the birth of credit, turning trust into a tradable commodity. In the bustling ports of the Indian Ocean, silver ingots told another story. Arab traders preferred coins, Chinese merchants demanded silk bolts as currency, and Southeast Asian kingdoms valued peppercorns. The solution: a fluid system where value wasn't fixed but negotiated. A captain might pay for repairs in Sri Lanka with silver, then barter the same silver for spices in Java, each transaction recalibrating the metal's worth. Money didn't just facilitate trade, it morphed to fit it. Then came the game changers, the Knights Templar. These warrior monks didn't just fight in the Crusades, they bankrolled them. Pilgrims could deposit funds at a Templar house in London and withdraw them in Jerusalem using encrypted letters of credit. Their network of fortresses doubled as the medieval equivalent of ATMs, complete with armed guards. The Templars didn't just move money, they made it mobile, secure, and borderless, laying the groundwork for modern finance. The most surprising twist: paper money, born from a maritime dilemma. When Chinese merchants tired of hauling heavy strings of copper coins, the Tang dynasty issued the first government-backed banknotes, lightweight, portable, and useless if the bureaucracy collapsed. By the time Marco Polo saw these flying money in action, it had already fueled centuries of Silk Road commerce. What linked these systems was adaptability. From cowries to clay tablets, each innovation solved a specific problem posed by the sea: distance, trust, and the need for flexible value. The next time you swipe a credit card or transfer funds online, remember, you're using the direct descendants of tools forged by ancient mariners who turned the chaos of the ocean into an engine of global trade. The winds that once filled Viking sails with promise began to howl with unrelenting bitterness as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip. Greenland's once verdant meadows froze solid, cutting off Norse settlements from vital trade routes that had sustained them for centuries. Archaeologists digging through midden heaps in Newfoundland found a chilling clue. The bones of livestock grew smaller over time, stunted by colder summers and failing pastures. Yet while the Vikings clung to fading traditions, the Inuit thrived, their flexible kayaks and seal hunting techniques proving better suited to the changing climate. The lesson written in those ice-strewn ruins wasn't about failure, it was about adaptation. When the old ways no longer worked, survival favored those who could read the land and see anew. Half a world away, the Indian Ocean's monsoon clock began skipping beats. Ancient Tamil manuscripts from the Chola Empire describe years when the rains arrived late or not at all, leaving merchant ships stranded in port with holds full of unsellable spices. Sailors who had once timed voyages to the precision of celestial calendars now faced unpredictable winds that could strand them for months. The response: a quiet revolution in shipbuilding. Dehouse grew shallower drafts to navigate receding rivers, while ports like Cambay invested in vast granaries to buffer against failed harvests. These weren't just practical fixes, they were systemic shifts, turning brittle trade networks into shock-absorbent webs. The Sea People's mysterious invasions make sudden sense when viewed through a climate lens. Tree rings from Anatolia tell of a decades-long drought that turned fertile valleys to dust, while Egyptian records speak of foreigners who came from the sea in war, but also in hunger. Imagine entire coastal communities, their wells gone saline from rising seas, their fields barren, loading families onto makeshift boats not for conquest but survival. The clay tablets they left behind pleas for grain, inventories of dwindling supplies paint a picture not of ruthless marauders, but climate refugees armed with desperation. Today's shipping giants face eerily similar challenges. The Panama Canal, a modern marvel of trade, now restricts traffic due to droughts lowering its water levels, just as ancient Phoenicians once abandoned Mediterranean ports when silted rivers cut them off from inland trade routes. Meanwhile, Arctic thawing opens new passages that would have made Viking explorers gasp, threatening to reroute global commerce overnight. The ancient mariner's greatest skill wasn't just navigation. It was reading the subtle cues of a changing world and pivoting before disaster struck. Perhaps the most poignant parallel lies in what archaeologists call the long adaptation. When Minoan traders faced rising seas, they didn't just build higher walls, they shifted to deeper-hulled ships that could reach new ports. When Mayan merchants confronted deforestation, they turned to canoe-borne trade rather than overland caravans. These weren't temporary fixes, but profound reinventions that kept commerce alive for generations. As modern supply chains strain under climate pressures, the past whispers a counterintuitive truth. Resilience isn't about resisting change, but embracing flux. The merchants who thrived were those who treated every storm as a signal to innovate, every drought as a prompt to diversify. Their legacy isn't just in the goods they moved, but in the nimble mindset they cultivated, one we do well to reclaim as our own uncertain waters rise. Bananas didn't start sweet, their wild ancestors in New Guinea were starchy, seedy things barely edible raw. But when ancient mariners carried these plants across Southeast Asia, something remarkable happened. Farmers selectively bred them into the sugary fruit we know today, transforming a humble tuber into a global staple. Meanwhile, in the Fertile Crescent, wheat's journey was even more dramatic. From its origins as a scraggly grass, Mesopotamian farmers cultivated it into the backbone of civilizations, its golden grains eventually sailing to Egypt, Greece, and beyond aboard Phoenician ships. These weren't just crops changing hands, they were genetic revolutions packed into woven baskets and clay pots. The real game changer, rice. When monsoon winds carried this grain from the Yangtze Delta to the African coast around 2,000 years ago, it didn't just fill bowls, it reshaped landscapes. Swahili farmers dug intricate irrigation channels to mimic Asian paddies, while Malagasy settlers brought rice to Madagascar in outrigger canoes. The result? A dietary staple that now feeds half the planet, its journey written in the DNA of strains from Basmati to Carolina Gold. Sugarcane tells a darker tale. First domesticated in New Guinea, it traveled to India, where Persian engineers perfected large-scale refining. By the time Arab traders brought it to the Mediterranean, sugar had morphed from a rare medicine to a status symbol, and eventually a driver of enslavement. The craving for sweetness built empires and destroyed lives, proving that food's power extended far beyond nutrition. Then there's the potato. Spanish galleons may have carried it from the Andes to Europe, but it was ancient Polynesian voyagers who first spread similar tubers across the Pacific centuries earlier. In Ireland, the potato's high yields allowed populations to boom until monoculture led to famine. In China, it became a lifeline during droughts, preventing countless starvations. A single crop, two hemispheres, countless destinies altered. What tied these stories together? Adaptation. Wheat mutated to suit new climates, rice diversified to survive pests, bananas hybridized to please palates. Ancient traders didn't just move food, they accelerated evolution itself, curating plants that could thrive far from home. The spices that flavored Roman feasts, the citrus that prevented scurvy on long voyages, the coconuts that sustained island hoppers. All were chapters in a saga of edible globalization we're still living today. The next time you peel a banana or stir sugar into your coffee, remember, you're tasting the legacy of sailors who turned the ocean into agriculture's greatest laboratory. Their cargo didn't just fill stomachs, it rewrote menus, toppled kingdoms, and connected continents one seed at a time. The wooden decks of merchant ships carried more than silks and spices. They became floating sanctuaries where gods and prophets sailed side by side. Buddhist monks clutching palm leaf sutras boarded Indian vessels bound for Sumatra, their teachings mingling with the salty spray as they translated scriptures into local tongues during the long monsoon passages. Meanwhile, Sufi mystics from Persia huddled in the cramped quarters of Arab dhows, their rhythmic chants blending with the creak of rigging as they carried Islam to the spice ports of Java. These weren't just travelers, they were spiritual innovators, adapting their messages to the rhythms of the sea. Consider the journey of a single bronze Buddha statue cast in Sri Lanka's workshops, purchased by a Tamil merchant and placed in the hold of a ship sailing for Cambodia. By the time it reached the temples of Angkor, its features had subtly shifted, fuller lips inspired by Khmer artisans, a slight softening of the meditative gaze to align with local aesthetics. Faith didn't just spread across the waves, it evolved with each landfall. The same statue might later inspire a Javanese shadow puppet depicting the Buddha's life, performed for crews in bustling Sunda Kelapa harbor. Christianity's maritime expansion took a different tack. When Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier stepped onto a Portuguese carrack bound for Japan in 1549, he carried not just a Bible but a shrewd understanding of trade politics. His strategy: target port cities first, where foreign ideas flowed as freely as goods. In Nagasaki, he baptized samurai converts using water from ships' casks, while further north, hidden Christian communities passed down faith through coded fishing songs that mimicked the calls of whalers. The sea didn't just carry religion, it reshaped its practices. Port cities became laboratories of coexistence unlike anywhere inland. In medieval Gwangju, Chinese officials allowed mosques to be built in pagoda styles, their minarets resembling Buddhist towers. A single street might feature a Hindu priest blessing a newly arrived ship, a Zoroastrian merchant performing dawn rites before checking his ledgers, and a Nestorian Christian hanging incense to ward off storms, all while local fishermen left offerings to Mazu, the sea goddess. This wasn't mere tolerance, it was pragmatic spirituality, where divine favor meant safe voyages and full warehouses. The real surprise: how commerce and devotion reinforced each other. Muslim traders in Malacca funded Buddhist stupas to build goodwill with Siamese clients. Jewish merchants in Alexandria donated to Coptic Christian churches that ensured their shipments. Even rival faiths shared sacred spaces. Sailors of all creeds might rub the same worn stone at a harbor shrine, each interpreting its power through their own lens. The ocean demanded cooperation. Superstition and scripture alike taught that no ship reached port without some higher mercy, yet this fluidity terrified inland powers. When Chinese emperors banned ocean voyages, they targeted not just trade but the foreign creeds it carried. Japanese shoguns, fearing European influence, crucified Christians near Nagasaki's docks as warnings. The sea's greatest threat wasn't piracy or storms, it was the uncontrollable exchange of ideas. Today's religious maps still bear these maritime fingerprints, the crescent moons atop Indonesian mosques echoing Middle Eastern designs, the Virgin Mary statues in Goa wearing saris, the Hindu temples in Bali where offerings float away on miniature boats. The waves never discriminate, they simply carry what we dare to send across them. Beneath the sun-bleached sails and salt-stained logs of ancient trade, a quieter history waits to be told, one where women weren't just passengers, but power players shaping maritime destiny. Take the Phoenician goddess Astarte, worshipped from Cyprus to Carthage. She wasn't some distant deity. Sailors painted her eyes on prows for protection, and temple priestesses doubled as financial advisors, managing the sacred silver that funded voyages. These women didn't just bless ships, they bankrolled them, wielding influence that stretched across the Mediterranean. In West Africa, Queen Amina of Zaria rewrote the rules of trade in the 16th century. While European maps showed empty coastlines, her warriors secured the Saharan caravan routes that fed gold into global markets. Amina didn't just tax passing merchants, she built fortified trading cities with walls so high they dwarfed contemporary European forts. Her negotiators, often women trained in multilingual diplomacy, brokered deals with Berber traders and Portuguese explorers alike, proving commerce required both swords and shrewdness. Half a world away, Ming Dynasty widows like Lady Zheng quietly financed treasure fleets from behind silk screens. When their merchant husbands perished at sea, these women inherited not just wealth but networks signing contracts with shipyards, ensuring cargoes, even commissioning new navigational charts. Archaeologists recently decoded account ledgers from Fujian province revealing female investors owned shares in over 40% of ocean-going junks. Their signatures, written in delicate calligraphy, appear beside bold red seals, proof that China's maritime golden age floated on matriarchal capital. Then there were the women who chose rebellion over ledgers. Grace O'Malley, the pirate queen of Connacht, commanded 300 men and a fleet of galleys that defied Elizabethan England. When officials seized her ships, she sailed to London herself, an unthinkable act for a woman in 1588, and negotiated their return face-to-face with Queen Elizabeth I. Across the Caribbean, Anne Bonny and Mary Read wielded cutlasses alongside Blackbeard's crew, their exploits so notorious that colonial governors specifically named them in anti-piracy laws. These weren't exceptions. Port records from Algiers to Assay brim with arrests of female smugglers and tavern owners who functioned as intelligence hubs for pirate networks. So why does history mute their voices? Partly because most chroniclers were male monks or officials who saw commerce as men's work. But dig deeper and clues emerge. A 5th century Greek merchant will discovered in Alexandria leaves his ship to his daughter on condition she not marry a fisherman. Norse sagas recount wives inheriting their husbands' trading rights in Greenland. Even the Rig Veda, ancient India's sacred text, describes women bartering woven cloth for Mesopotamian tin along the Indus River ports. The sea, it turns out, was far more egalitarian than the land. In the fluid world of harbors and markets, skill often trumped gender. A widow who could calculate interest rates or speak multiple languages became an asset, not an outlier. Pirate ships, desperate for skilled hands, judged recruits by their ability, not their sex. And in cultures from Polynesia to Phoenicia, women controlled the sacred knowledge of tides and stars that made voyages possible. Resurfacing these stories requires rethinking where we look, not just in official chronicles, but in the pottery shards inscribed with women's names found in Viking trading posts. the lawsuits filed by Geno's businesswomen over unpaid spice debts, the West African oral poems praising queen traders whose caravans shook the earth like thunder. The ocean didn't erase these women, it carried their legacies in every wave that ever rocked a merchant ship or filled a pirate's sail. We've just been reading the maps wrong. The towering cedars of Lebanon once formed an unbroken green canopy stretching to the Mediterranean, until Phoenician shipbuilders began felling them by the thousands. Each massive trunk, dragged to coastal yards by teams of oxen, became the spine of a trading vessel destined to crisscross the ancient world. Within centuries, entire mountainsides stood bare, their soil washing into the sea. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across the ancient world, the hunger for ships and harbors reshaped landscapes with startling speed. Roman engineers dredged up entire reefs to build concrete harbors at Caesarea, while Greek colonists on Cyprus stripped hillsides of pine to fuel their bronze smelters, leaving behind skeletal slopes that still struggle to regrow today. The pursuit of luxury goods left even deeper scars. Take the murex snail, source of Phoenician purple dye. Harvesting just 1 gram of the precious pigment required crushing nearly 10,000 mollusks, a slaughter so vast that ancient Tyre's shoreline became choked with rotting shells. By the Roman era, the snails had vanished from entire stretches of coast, their extinction memorialized in imperial edicts restricting purple clothing to the elite. Similarly, the exotic animal trade drained ecosystems to feed Rome's arena spectacles. Giraffes from Somalia, lions from Nubia, even polar bears shipped from Norway. Entire species vanished from regions where they'd once thrived, all to satisfy fleeting moments of imperial spectacle. Coral reefs suffered perhaps the most irreversible damage. From the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, divers chiseled away at living reefs to construct lime for mortar or carve into jewelry. In Alexandria, Cleopatra's palace gleamed with red coral columns, each one the calcified remains of centuries of slow marine growth destroyed in months. The irony stings. These very reefs had once sheltered the fish stocks that fed coastal cities. Their destruction undermining the food security trade was meant to ensure. Yet ancient societies weren't blind to these costs. Minoan tablets from Crete record the earliest known conservation laws, strict quotas on cypress cutting for ships. The Mauryan Empire in India designated protected forests where unauthorized logging carried the death penalty. Even the Romans, despite their excesses, experimented with sustainable solutions. Oyster farms in Britannia replenished wild stocks, while terraced vineyards prevented soil erosion along trade routes. These weren't eco-conscious gestures by modern standards, but pragmatic responses to scarcity that threatened commerce itself. The parallels to today's climate crises are uncomfortably precise. Just as Phoenician deforestation altered local rainfall patterns, modern palm oil plantations disrupt monsoons. Where Roman animal traders emptied savannas, industrial fishing now strips oceans bare. Even the murex's fate echoes in today's collapsing bee populations, another casualty of humanity's appetite for the rare and beautiful. The difference lies in scale and awareness. Ancient merchants could blame ecological collapse on angry gods. We track planetary degradation in real-time satellite feeds. So what can these ancient failures and flickers of wisdom teach us? First, that trade and sustainability have always been locked in tension. Neither can exist without the other in the long run. Second, that solutions emerge not from idealism, but from enlightened self-interest. When Venetian merchants realized overfishing threatened their salt cod trade, they imposed seasonal bans that allowed stocks to recover. When Song dynasty tea growers saw deforestation eroding their slopes, they pioneered contour planting techniques still used today. Perhaps the most hopeful lesson lies in the resilience of nature itself. Off Lebanon's coast, marine biologists recently discovered a surviving colony of murex snails in a hidden cove, descendants of the few that escaped ancient harvesters. Their shells still produce that legendary purple, albeit now protected by conservation laws. It's a reminder that the balance between human ambition and ecological limits isn't impossible. It just requires the humility to learn from both our ancestors' mistakes and their occasional, hard-won wisdom. The recipe for Roman concrete was one of antiquity's best-kept secrets, a waterproof marvel that hardened underwater, turning harbors like Caesarea into eternal monuments. Then, like so much maritime knowledge, it vanished with the empire's fall. For centuries, medieval builders puzzled over crumbling docks, unaware that the answer lay in a forgotten blend of volcanic ash and seawater. Even today, engineers still study these ancient piers, which have endured 2,000 years of waves while modern concrete crumbles in decades. The irony. We've sent probes to Mars, yet we're only now relearning what every Roman dockworker knew by heart. Not all technologies faded into obscurity. The Austronesian outrigger canoe, perfected over millennia, still skims across Pacific waves with the same grace it did when lapita potters first lashed logs together. Modern replicas like the Hokulea have proven these designs can cross oceans without compasses or charts. Just the whispered knowledge of star paths passed down through chance. What's astonishing isn't just their survival, but their sophistication. Outriggers distribute weight so precisely that they're now studied by aerospace engineers for balancing spacecraft payloads. Beneath the Mediterranean's turquoise surface, robots are mapping trade routes once thought mythical. In 2021, divers off Sicily found a Phoenician shipwreck laden with incense, proof that these sailors braved open water centuries earlier than historians believed. Elsewhere, sonar has revealed ship graveyards near ancient Tartessos in Spain, where vessels carrying Atlantean-era bronze sank with cargoes so intact you can still see the weave of Egyptian linen wrapping the ingots. Each discovery peels back another layer of the past, like pages of a drowned ledger finally surfacing. The most tantalizing gaps in our knowledge may lie in the Indian Ocean, where medieval Arab geographers described fleets of 1,000 ships linking China to Africa. Only a handful of these vessels have been found, but their remnants hint at staggering scale. A single 13th century wreck near Java held enough iron to arm an army, thousands of perfectly preserved ingots stamped with Chinese characters. Who ordered this metal? What wars did it fuel? The answers likely lie in undiscovered ports now buried under mangrove swamps or coastal dunes. What makes these lost technologies so compelling isn't just their ingenuity, it's the reminder that progress isn't a straight line. Civilizations rise, forget, and rediscover in cycles we're only beginning to trace. The next time you see a cargo ship stacked with containers, remember, its ancestor might be sitting on the seafloor right now, holding secrets that could upend everything we know about the ancient world's reach. The ocean never loses, it just waits. The idea that ancient civilizations existed in isolation crumbles under the weight of evidence scattered across oceans and continents. Take Easter Island, that tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific, where the famous Moai statues stand sentinel. For years, their existence baffled scholars. How could such a remote place produce such monumental art? The answer lies in the islanders' Polynesian heritage, a seafaring lineage that connected them to a web of voyagers stretching from Tahiti to Hawaii. These weren't stranded castaways, they were part of a deliberate migration network, their double-hulled canoes carrying not just people but entire ecosystems, taro roots, chickens, and even the rats that stowed away in their holds. The same currents that made the island seem isolated to outsiders were, in fact, highways for its settlers. Then there's the mystery of African crops in the Americas long before Columbus. Sweet potatoes, native to South America, somehow made their way to Polynesian gardens by the year 1000. Meanwhile, bananas, originally from Southeast Asia, appeared in West Africa around the same time. These weren't accidents of nature, but the result of intentional exchange, likely facilitated by unsung voyages across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Imagine a Polynesian canoe blown off course washing up on South American shores, or an African trader catching the equatorial current, drifting to Brazil's coast. These encounters left no grand monuments or written records, just the quiet, undeniable evidence of shared crops and DNA. Roman coins tell an even more startling story. In the jungles of Vietnam, archaeologists unearthed a trove of 2nd century Roman denarii silver pieces bearing the faces of emperors like Antoninus Pius. How did they get there? Not through direct trade, but through the intricate relay of intermediaries, Roman merchants selling to Indian middlemen, who passed them to Southeast Asian sailors, who carried them upriver to local rulers. Each coin was a tiny ambassador, proof that even the mightiest empires were just nodes in a global network they barely understood. This reshapes history in profound ways. We often picture the past as a series of disconnected bubbles, Egypt here, China there, the Maya over there, each developing in splendid isolation. But the truth is messier and far more fascinating. Cultures didn't just bump into each other occasionally. They were constantly borrowing, adapting, and trading, often across staggering distances. The ocean wasn't a barrier, it was the world's oldest social network. The implications ripple into the present. If globalization isn't a modern invention but a human instinct, then today's interconnected world isn't an aberration, it's a return to form. The difference is scale, not substance. Ancient traders may not have had container ships or the internet, but they shared the same drive to explore, connect, and profit from the unknown. Their voyages remind us that isolation is the myth and connection, the enduring reality. From Phoenician merchants navigating by the stars to Polynesian voyagers reading ocean swells like maps, these ancient mariners did more than cross physical distances, they bridged worlds. Their wooden ships carried more than spices and silk, they transported entire civilizations into conversation with one another. The bronze mirrors of Han china found in Viking graves, the Roman glass unearthed in Japanese tombs, the African ivory carved into chess pieces for Indian kings, every artifact whispers the same truth: globalization isn't a modern invention. It's humanity's oldest habit. What's startling isn't just how far they traveled, but how deeply their choices still shape us. The Arabic numerals you use to check prices, the alphabet on your screen, even the spices in your kitchen, all flowed through networks these sailors risked their lives to build. When medieval traders standardized weights and measures from Zanzibar to Canton, they laid the groundwork for today's shipping containers and tariffs. The insurance contracts drafted in Venetian harbors evolved into the complex financial systems that now underpin global trade. The past isn't just present, it's operating beneath our fingertips every day. Yet their greatest legacy isn't in what they moved, but how they moved it. Faced with monsoons and pirates, they didn't just survive, they adapted. Phoenicians switched from cedar to pine when forests dwindled. Polynesians adjusted sail designs to harness shifting winds. The Indian Ocean's merchant communities developed early forms of diplomacy to resolve disputes without violence. These weren't just practical fixes, they were philosophies in action, proof that resilience thrives on flexibility, not rigidity. Now, as rising seas threaten coastal cities and trade wars fray supply chains, their wisdom feels urgently relevant. The Vikings abandoned Greenland when climates cooled, but the Inuit stayed by innovating with kayaks and seal skin floats. The solution wasn't fighting change, but flowing with it. Similarly, the ancient spice trade collapsed when Europeans demanded monopoly instead of partnership, a warning for any system that prioritizes control over cooperation. The ocean never offered guarantees, only opportunities. Those who succeeded listened to its rhythms rather than resisting them. Today's challenges, migration crises, resource scarcity, cultural clashes, are just new tides in an old sea. The difference is we have their stories as compasses. Whether it's adopting sustainable practices from indigenous fishing traditions or reviving the Indian Ocean's model of multicultural exchange, the blueprints for balance already exist. We just need to navigate by them, so the next time you see a container ship on the horizon or taste cinnamon in your coffee, remember, you're part of a story that began millennia ago when the first daring souls pushed past the shoreline. Their courage didn't just connect continents, it redefined what was possible, and that's a voyage worth continuing. If you've enjoyed unraveling these hidden threads of history, hit subscribe to explore more forgotten chapters that shaped our world. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear which ancient maritime marvel surprised you most. Until next time, keep sailing into the past. The waves have plenty left to